Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. It is because human beings are good that they use propaganda to hide or to justify the crimes of their ancestors and their long-term consequences. This video is the first of a series of short videos that I decided to make in order to correct the most obvious English-Canadian misconceptions about Quebec. And to achieve that goal, I will say the truth, all the truth, and nothing but the truth. And to prove my points, I will put a very detailed bibliography at the end of each of those videos. In this first video, I will show you that contrary to a common English-Canadian belief, the equalization payment made to Quebec don't come from Alberta. They come from the federal taxes paid by all Canadians, including Quebecers. It means that Quebecers will pay a large part of the $13 billion of equalization payments they will receive in 2019. Of course, the oil-rich Alberta does contribute more to the equalization program than it receives, and Quebec receives more than it contributes. However, as I will show you in this video, the equalization program is nothing more than a propaganda tool. In reality, Quebec is and has always been the big loser in the Canadian Federation. If French-speaking Quebecers have been among the poorest ethnic groups of Canada during more than 2 centuries, it was not because of their culture. They were Catholic, French-speaking, and rich before the invasion of 1760. No, if they remained poor since then, it was because they have been subjected to systemic racism. In Canada, the big difference between Alberta and Quebec is that Albertans became rich because they sit on a gigantic petroleum deposit, while Quebecers remained poor because they were not allowed to take advantage of the fact that they sit on the most important strategic and economical entrance of all North America. In the 2 Canadian Constitutions of 1867 and of 1982, which have been imposed upon Quebec against its will, all the profits made by the vehicles and the goods passing through Quebec territory belongs to the federal government. Not a penny goes to Quebec. As I will show you, it is not like that elsewhere in the world. Nowhere, in fact. If modern Quebecers refuse the passage of petroleum through their territory, it is because they don't want the pollution it would create or another accident like the one that killed 47 Quebecers in Lac Mégantic in 2013. Albertans can threaten to separate from Canada as much as they want. Quebecers don't really care since they almost never go in Western Canada, while English Canadians regularly pass through Quebec in order to reach Ontario, the Prairies, the Maritimes, or the Atlantic Ocean. Anyway, it's very easy to show that the so-called Wexit would be a mistake for Western Canada. To understand what I'm talking about, you must first realize that Alberta is landlocked and that its oil cannot reach the world markets without passing through at least one other Canadian province. It's striking that Alberta is just one province away from the Pacific Ocean and relatively close to the Chinese market, and yet its leaders want to export their petroleum through the Atlantic Ocean by building the longest pipeline in North America. Moreover, the Energy East pipeline has been designed to carry the largest quantity of oil of all the 4 new Canadian pipelines recently proposed. Why is it like that? It is because of the Rocky Mountains. To export petroleum by passing through the Rockies, it is necessary to build multiple and very costly pumping stations, or to build very expensive bridges and tunnels if you decide to do it by trucks or by trains. In the Rockies, there are regular landslides, countless curves, and many hills to climb up and down. Passing through the Rockies is so expensive that it takes 4 locomotives to pull a train, while only one is necessary in the prairies or in the flat and straight valley like the St. Lawrence Valley in Quebec. It is so economical to pass through Quebec that for 2 centuries, most of the towns and cities in the prairies have been built inside a sort of funnel that ends up in Thunder Bay on the western end of the Superior Lake. And from Thunder Bay, all the roads, railroads, and seaway passing through northern Ontario go to Quebec without passing through the most densely populated part of Ontario. Since the St. Lawrence lowlands are located between the Laurentian Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, Montreal has always been a natural choke point for all the communication networks coming from Western Canada, Ontario, and the American Great Lakes. As a matter of fact, the St. Lawrence Valley, which is flat, straight, and navigable from Montreal until the Atlantic Ocean, is the most important natural entrance of all North America. It gives access to the world's largest lake system, the Great Lakes, which are located in the middle of the richest continent on Earth. This is even visible from space. Montreal is so well located that it is also at the end of the Richelieu-Hudson Valley, which goes directly from Montreal to New York City. On top of having a very compact and economical communication system, Montreal has some major road interchanges, the most spectacular of them being the so-called échangeurs turcaux. Why? Now, what does it mean for the grain, gas, and petroleum exports of Alberta? It means that the equalization payments Quebec receives are not a gift. It is money which is owed to Quebec, money that will be paid many times by English Canada when Quebec will become independent. Of course, it will no longer be called equalization payments, but transit fees. By doing that, Quebec will simply behave like any other normal independent state of the world. Here is a long and yet incomplete list of the independent countries of the world which impose transit fees for any foreign petroleum that crosses their territory. You can verify what I just said by typing those references on Yahoo. To give you an idea how profitable such transit fees would be for an independent Quebec, let's take the example of the Energy East pipeline, and let's assume that Quebec would impose transit fees which would be equivalent to the price reduction the Americans often demand when they buy Albertan petroleum, which is 40%. Check, it's also in the bibliography. Also, let's assume that $1 is equal to 1.35 Canadian dollar. As you can see, an independent Quebec would make $30 billion a year with only one pipeline. And don't forget that Quebec would then be allowed to charge transit fees for all the cars, buses, trucks, trains, boats, planes, gas pipelines that would pass through its territory both ways. When they realize that, English Canadians often retort that if Quebec was to impose transit fees on the St. Lawrence Seaway, for example, Canada would simply do the same thing in the Canadian territorial waters in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Unfortunately for them, this is strictly forbidden by the international law. That prohibition is called the right of innocent passage, and it applies to the French Saint-Pierre and Miquelon Islands that are totally surrounded by Canadian territorial waters in the Gulf. Another example of that situation is found on the Red Sea, where boats pay a transit fee to pass through the Suez Canal, but nothing to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Check, it's also in the bibliography. Why is it like that? It is because transit fees are not justified when no expenses were incurred by the coastal states to keep open a natural oceanic strait. That applies to the Gibraltar Strait, the Hormuz Strait, the Malacca Strait, the Tsushima Strait, etc. On the other hand, transit fees are allowed on all the artificial waterways which have been made navigable by the coastal states. This is the case of the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Kiel Canal in Germany, and, surprise, on the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is equipped with locks, lighthouses, icebreakers, pilots and security services, 8 tall bridges to allow the passage of oceanic vessels, etc. If none of the fees collected in the St. Lawrence Valley goes to Quebec, it is because New France has been invaded by the British in 1760 and has been kept under the control of English Canada ever since. Now, let's talk about the generous transfer payments given to an ungrateful Quebec by English Canada. First, let's use the data provided by the federal government itself. Second, don't forget that those transfer payments include the equalization payments. Third, it is important to understand that wealth can only be compared when we consider the wealth by person. The first discovery we make when we analyze those transfer payments is that Ontario and Alberta receive half the transfer payments per person that Quebec receives. Now, if we compare the total payments received by each province, we discover that Ontario receives almost as much federal transfer payments as Quebec. How come? Because Ontario receives much more transfer payments for its health and social programs than Quebec. Now, if we analyze the equalization program alone, it is easy to show that it has been designed to impress people, especially Quebecers, since it takes into account only the payments made to the 10 provinces of Canada. By using that trick, Quebec seems to receive 62% of all the equalization payments made by the federal government. Wow, that looks impressive, at least until you realize that there are other territories in Canada populated by real people, real Canadians, for instance, the 3 northern territories, which also receive equalization payments called the TFF, the Territorial Formula Financing, which are partly paid by Quebec taxpayers. When included, the TFF reduces the Quebec share to 52%. The balloon starts deflating. Now, if we look at the equalization payments by person, Quebec is at the very bottom of the receiving provinces. Worse, each Quebecer receives 30 times less money than a citizen of Nunavut. How can it be that Quebec receives 52% of the equalization payments and receives so little per person? The answer is simple. It is because Quebec has the population of an independent country. In fact, Quebec has 1.6 times more inhabitants than 9 of the 12 provinces and territory of English Canada put together. I forgot to mention that Quebec federal taxes also subsidize the programs destined to the natives of English Canada who are also Canadians living in real Canadian territories. The thing is that the natives living in English Canada are proportionally 3 times as many as those living in Quebec. If we summarize what we just said, Quebec federal taxes pay a large part of the different equalization payments paid to Quebec itself, to the 3 northern territories, and to the natives of English Canada. On top of that, Quebec will someday have to pay its share of the Canadian federal debt that was incurred to subsidize all those programs. Please don't forget what I said about the extremely profitable transit fees that will replace the equalization payments in an independent Quebec. Now a question remains. Why do Quebec politicians refuse to use those proven facts to convince Quebecers that they would be much better off, economically speaking, if they were to separate? There are 2 reasons for that. First, it's because our politicians are not worth more than your own politicians. And the second reason is because they are afraid of you. Quebecers are not. They are. Sorry to disappoint you, but you have to disprove what I just showed you, or you have to live with it. Please feel free to share that video on the internet. See you next time.